Welcome to the Only Words podcast, where poets and poetry lovers talk about the role of the art in their lives and the modern world.
Hello there, people of the internet. My name is Riley Richards, and I've been immersed in this poetry business for a little more than a decade now. I hold an MFA in poetry from Fairleigh Dickinson's brilliant master's program, and I taught poetry, creative writing, and political writing at Uzhhorod National University in Ukraine. At the time of this recording, I have also begun the process of pursuing my PhD, so fingers crossed for that. Before we dive in, I want to thank the poet and my very good friend Emmy Forbes for inviting me on the air, so to speak, and for facilitating these conversations.
When did you discover or were introduced to poetry?
I think for me, the real question would be, when did I first recognize poetry? Recognize it for the art, the force, and the worldview that it can be. That would have been the first year of my bachelor's degree in creative writing, where I was converted from a dream of a career as a genre thriller writer to the no-looking-back life of a poet by the joint powers of my mentor John Estes and every poet's mentor, Rainer Maria Rilke. Rilke said, "This above all, ask yourself in the stillest hour of your night, must I write? Delve into yourself for a deep answer, and if this should be affirmative, if you may meet this earnest question with a strong and simple, I must, then build your life according to this necessity. Your life, even into its most indifferent and slightest hour, must be a sign of this urge and a testimony to it." And he was right. If your heart is open and you're called to it, poetry gets its hooks in you and never lets go. To quote Estes now, either you are marked and give yourself over to it, or you move on. Recently, after I finished a draft for my first manuscript, Estes read it and gave me some wonderfully constructive feedback. And then he said, "Riley, you're a real enough poet now that I need to apologize for ruining your life." First, hot damn, my friend, mentor, and writer of what remains my all-time favorite collection of poems, Sure Extinction from Elixir Press, just said that I was a real goddamn poet. Second, he's right, it does ruin you, but in the best way that you can be ruined, like spiritual revelation or falling in love. It's transfigurative. Another poet, also the subject of my master's thesis, Fanny Howe, tells us that one definition of the lyric might be that it is a method of searching for something that can't be found. It's an air that blows and buoys and settles. It says, not this, instead of, I have it. That's not to say that poetry is inherently a force of negativity or that things cannot be found or discovered through poetry. On the contrary, poetry is a force of creation and life, and I would argue it is one of the best practices of discovery a person could do. I think the idea here is that poetry is not merely an expression of things that are already known, like emotion, experience, political position, or even beautiful descriptions of the world and all that's in it. The most successful poetry, I think, arises out of curiosity, bewilderment, and faith. In other words, successful poetry to me is apophatic. Just like all the rest of life, really. As my father always says, fruit only rots when it's ripe. And that is only the beginning. Where poetry really gets spicy is the craft of it. The technical artistry of sculpting these beautiful, substantial little collections of language. The non-denotative and non-semantic aspects of words married to their hard dictionary definitions. Syntax and rhythm. The sonic qualities of the words, lines and line breaks. The composition of them feels almost biological to me. Like the functionality of a cell or organism. They're alive in form and spirit. I just got a text from a friend of mine, like right this minute, that almost has me in tears. He says, "The nice thing about spirit is that it is so elevated, it's not possible to ever lose it. But I have deep, deep sympathies with the dirt and miss the soil and would gladly dig and slop around in the mud if it weren't so hard." I'll put that side by side with one more quote, one by the poet Scott Cairns, when he was essentially asked, "Why poetry?" And that one has been consuming my thoughts for about a month and a half now. He says, "I actually believe when we find peace, thousands will come to salvation."
What do you love most about poetry?
I don't know if that's answerable for me in concise terms, or really if it's answerable at all. But I love the digging and the slopping around in the mud. I love the bewilderment, the difficulty, the craft, the beauty. I love the transforming and restorative power of it. I love that it fucking infects you. I love the peace and the salvation. Yeah. Anyways, before I finish this ramble, I will recommend to anyone who is interested in reading good poetry, in addition to the poets I have already mentioned, my favorite poet, Kimberly Johnson, specifically her book, A Metaphorical God, but all are amazing. The chapbook, The Way Back by Russell Carrick, the forthcoming What Love Is by David Daniel, Bored in Arcane Cursive Under Lodgepole Bark by H.L. Hicks, Budget Travel Through Time and Space by Albert Goldbarth, and many, many more. I could talk about fabulous poetry all day long. I really could, so hit me up if you want to.
What do you hope readers take away from your poetry?
I took a walk down my street to prepare for this. I live on a straightaway on a windy road in the foothills of Mount Baker. Most of the street was clear-cut, I don't know, probably about a decade ago, but I finally began to notice the return of the forest and underbrush. I could no longer see over or beyond the first few rows of trees. On either side of the road there are thousands of daisies, the shoulders filthy with them. I could hear at least half a dozen different bird calls, and off in the distance, a rooster crowing vespers. I recently received an email from my favorite poet, the wonderful and inimitable Kimberly Johnson. I'd emailed her asking, essentially, what is the value of poetry? Is it truly something, as it so often feels like it is, worth devoting our time and our lives to? Her answer, like her poetry, was thoughtful, generous, wise, and, above all, honest. Ultimately, the answer remains inconclusive, but one point she made, I think, bears repeating. She said that one tangible virtue of poetry is that it trains the mind to attentiveness, which is, she says, and I think rightly, another word for reverence. It is, as I'm sure all of you will agree, too easy to get sucked in by the whirlwind of the day-to-day grind. My time and attention get nickel and dimed to death, largely because I'm so oblivious to it happening. The small potatoes distractions keep me chasing my tail until I realize I never had a goddamn tail to begin with. Poetry helps slow it all down, sure, but it really forces you to not only just notice and observe things more, but to value them more. Honestly, when it comes down to it, I think what the world maybe needs most is attentiveness and reverence. Of course, poetry is not, in Kimberly Johnson's words, a metanoia machine, as much as I often wish that it was, as though holiness and enlightenment, sanctification and betterment could be achieved through osmosis or thinking about it enough. What a crazy, wonderful, sloppy-ass world we live in. And that's really it, isn't it? If I can say nothing else about poetry, both as a writer and as a reader, it makes being alive more palatable to me. I know that's the experience for many of us, especially with poetry, and what greater value is there than to help us, once again in Johnson's words, love the world a little bit better. This is my long way round answer to the question. When someone reads my poetry, even the hard or sad or angry stuff I may write, I hope that the reader comes away appreciating life a little bit more. Theirs or someone else's. Or even on a more micro level, some part of the world that they didn't love as much before. Like my friend, the poet Emily Light, I will never look at blowing bubbles the same way again after reading one of her poems. A turn of phrase can change someone's life. I hope it increases understanding, but not for understanding's sake. Instead, for the sake of betterment, of reverence, of love in the truest, most transformative, verbiest sense. I want people to feel the same way after reading my poems that I feel after reading Kimberly Johnson's. I'm getting to the point, too, where I'm trying to, and beginning to, view poetry as an act of worship. I can think of no more worthwhile motivation for a human being to do anything on this earth than that. And the way I figure it, poetry is the closest thing on this earth to the language of eternity.
Is there a poem by another poet that you wish you had written, and why?
The truth is, there are so many poems I wish I had written. It's the one facet in my life where jealousy is permissible to me, because it's hard for me to love a piece of writing that I am not also jealous of. I'm constantly jealous of, say, Russell Carrick. Also, for those of you who have not read his chapbook, The Way Back from Slappering Whole Press, holy Jesus, you should do that immediately. I often make the joke that if I were ever to achieve the power of time travel, I would go back to 1854 and publish Song of Myself a year before Walt Whitman did. The poem Easter in Lisbon by Paisley Rekdal might as well be the Ten Commandments for how much it's guided me. The single poem, though, that I most wish I had written is my favorite poem. Inevitably, it is Kimberly Johnson's. I'm not sure, however, how to tell you its title, as the title is just empty brackets. Solid fucking gold example of the apophatic in poetry, by the way. It's in her collection, A Metaphorical God, which everybody who loves poetry is honor-bound to read. The truth, complexity, and mastery of craft in this poem is absolutely bananas. Not only is the rawness of emotion not an obstacle for her craft, it is part of the craft, and the content and truth she explores penetrates me to the soul.
Is there any advice you wish you had received when you started writing poetry?
One of the sadder perks of aging, at least in my experience, is that so much of what I've learned I already knew. For me, the question isn't so much about advice I wish I'd received as much as advice I wish had sunk in, that I'd listened to, that I'd recognized for the truth that it was. So many of my truest beliefs now are things that my father told me when I was young that I had dismissed and then gone on to discover were true years later, usually through pain and failure. Maybe that's just the nature of growing up, of being a shithead, realizing that you are, in fact, a shithead, and beginning to do your due diligence to unbecome a shithead. When it comes to poetry, though, I think the big piece of advice I wish I'd listened to is true for just about every aspect of life, and that is discipline. Poetry is a beautiful art, sure, and it's emotive and powerful, and you can get swept up in it. I used to tell my students that poetry is performance before expression, which begins to get at this idea that writing isn't just the kiss of muse or inspiration striking from above, or especially not feelings too enormous and too real to keep inside. If you're writing for anyone other than yourself to read, writing is, by nature, performative, and I would argue that it is so regardless. Of course, I'm not saying that there is no truth to writing, or that in its performative nature, it is therefore fake. I think that there's more truth in writing, especially performative writing, than in most things. If it wasn't a performance, even a performance of daring and personal vulnerability, it would just be a journal entry. It's the writer's obligation, and perhaps even the writer's moral obligation, to care for and attend to their craft when they write, as well as their personal expression. The form, structure, and execution of the content is what makes the content art. But performance doesn't quite cover discipline for me. What I didn't accept back at the beginning, and I still struggle with now, to be honest, is that writing poetry is a relationship with poetry, and it requires the same level and same variety of investment that you would offer any other relationship. It requires sacrifice, time, choice. It requires two-way communication by reading and writing. It requires thinking about when it's not in front of you. It requires a pretty gritty real-world devotion that transcends a skill or a hobby. I remember in an undergrad poetry class, John Estes tried to get us to develop this intentional mindfulness. He had us take this semester-long course on discipline, and week one asked us only to lay out our clothes for the next morning, the night before. That was it. Just make the choice, take 30 seconds, lay out your clothes for the next day. We raised such an unholy stink that he abandoned the assignment. We couldn't do that one thing on the first week, and we thought we had what it took to be writers. Honestly, he should have failed us all. But he was right, and it stuck with me. And years later, it's 9:34 p.m., and I have laid out my clothes for tomorrow.
What advice would you give to someone just starting out with writing poetry?
Don't be precious. The earlier an artist can learn this, the quicker their art can really become great. Or at the very least, they will be less offended by every real and imagined slight that grazes their feelings. It's easy to take criticism personally, especially if you love the line or piece. I've had comments in and out of poetry workshops about my work that have stung, but many of the most brutal comments come from people I trust and who genuinely care about helping me become a better writer. Their comments don't come from their own aesthetic or poetic taste either, but from objective principles and good writing, and those are often the comments that I'm most grateful for. Many principles in good writing are objective, but much of artistic and aesthetic taste is subjective, and I am slowly getting to the point where I think that is often a fabulous thing. If you have good craft, anything goes. One thing I am repeatedly grateful for is when I find work that I don't like, but that I recognize as good. Another reason some writers may be precious or overly sensitive toward criticism is the often deeply personal nature of their writing. For me, the solution to this has simply been perspective. Much of what I write has been personal, emotional, vulnerable, and certainly autobiographical. What happens, though, is that as soon as the eye hits the page, even if the piece is 100% autobiographical, the I ceases to be me. It becomes a character, still me to an extent, but independent of me, like Peter Pan's shadow. Once again, writing is performance before expression. There is a narrative distance, or better yet, professional distance between the writer and the writer's subject, almost clinical even as it is deeply felt. Having this distance helps, too, the practice of bewilderment and discovery in poetry. I think where a lot of people go wrong with poetry is that they enter into the poem having already determined what they will write, what they need to express or get off their chest, what needs to be said, or worst of all, what the reader needs to hear. A new poet should go into writing with love and fire and investment, but also with balance and perspective. If the goal is to write good poems, one should situate themselves and their attitudes around that and what it takes to get there. Thanks again to Emmy Forbes and everyone listening, whether they give a damn about poetry or not. The last thing I will add is that whenever I teach, I have my students read chapter 52 of Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, and then have them do their own barbaric yap. I'll ask all of you to do the same.
Thank you for listening to Only Words. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review. Check out our other episodes. Share this podcast with anyone you think may enjoy it. And most of all, please do join us again next month for another conversation about poetry. Until then, live compassionately, love always, and read more poetry.